Buenas tardes o buenas noches. Les damos la bienvenida a este ciclo de diálogos sobre la enseñanza de la arquitectura, el diseño y el urbanismo. Yo soy Polo Jaimes, soy el director de la Cátedra Antonio Díaz, que es una cátedra libre, radicada en la Facultad de Arquitectura, Diseño y Urbanismo de la Universidad de Buenos Aires. La cátedra es una iniciativa de personas que fuimos influidas por el trabajo de Antonio Díaz, Tony Díaz, que para muchas personas no necesita presentación, pero por si hace falta decirlo, fue uno de los más influyentes arquitectos argentinos, con una carrera de más de 50 años, en la que, como en raros casos, se unieron 4 campos de trabajo: la teoría, la enseñanza, la investigación y la práctica profesional. Voy a hacer una breve introducción a la actividad de hoy, que inaugura un ciclo de diálogos, de conversaciones que hemos organizado en el marco de la cátedra que tiene especial interés en ser un espacio con 2 cuestiones muy relevantes que forman parte de lo que fueron los intereses de Tony Díaz durante toda su vida, que es un perfil intergeneracional, es decir, pasar el legado y los debates de cierta generación a otras generaciones nuevas, y también llevar estos debates más allá del campo propio de origen de este proyecto y también de Tony Díaz, que fue la ciudad de Buenos Aires, la Universidad de Buenos Aires, la arquitectura de Buenos Aires, el urbanismo de Buenos Aires. Con esto buscamos recuperar cierta tradición de continuidad en estos debates acerca de la relación entre el mundo de las ideas y el mundo de la práctica arquitectónica. Repito aquí algunas de las palabras que pronuncié en nuestra primera ocasión de ponernos frente a un público académico y general, que hace 2 años tuvimos la oportunidad, el honor de presentar una charla, una conferencia del arquitecto Jorge Silvetti en nuestra facultad, en nuestra universidad, y a través de él también tuvimos la oportunidad de conocer a una de las personas participantes de este primer diálogo de hoy, a Nader Tehrani, que va a conversar con Gabriel Feld. Esta cátedra entonces busca de alguna manera trabajar en esta tensión, en esta relación entre el campo de las ideas y el campo de la arquitectura. Y antes ya de pasar a la presentación de las 2 personas que hoy nos acompañan, más otras 2 que van a entrar en una segunda parte, quiero hacer algunos breves agradecimientos, sobre todo al equipo de dirección y organización de la cátedra que me acompaña en esta tarea. Hoy estoy yo, pero somos muchas personas: Luis Lucía, Gabriel Feld, que está hoy como participante de este encuentro, Carlos Rabinovich, Claudia Santaló, Fernando Yavén, y también un equipo asesor de intelectuales destacados, encabezado por la esposa de Tony, Margarita Gorfinkiel, que desde Madrid con su familia viene apoyando este proyecto de una manera muy generosa. Y luego también Justo Solsona, Jorge Silvetti, a quien ya mencioné, Rodolfo Machado, Pancho Liernur, Isabel Martínez de San Vicente, Manuel Fernández de Luco y Roberto Lombardi. También agradecer al diseñador gráfico argentino Gustavo Esteche, responsable de nuestra hermosa imagen gráfica del proyecto de la cátedra. Vamos ahora las presentaciones de de la actividad de hoy, contar un poco cómo la vamos a hacer. Si quieren, Nader y Gabriel, encender sus cámaras, ya los podemos ir viendo. Vamos a hacer entonces este primer encuentro. Bienvenidos y muchas gracias por haber estado dispuestos a participar. Thank you, Nader, for being here. Gracias, Gabriel, por haber organizado esto y preparar la actividad junto con Nader. Vamos a hacer una charla que va a ser en general en castellano, con algunas partes en inglés. Seguramente Nader va a expresarse en la lengua en la que está más cómodo, y será Gabriel, Gaby, para todos, y que irá comentando alguna cuestión que requiera, por un tema de idioma, mayor aclaración para un público que es fundamentalmente de habla española, castellana, pero también decir que están invitados a esta actividad colegas y equipos académicos también del Uruguay, de Brasil, de Colombia, de México, de España, de Alemania, de Italia, y esperemos que llegue a ellos y ellas también. Nader Tehrani es arquitecto, es fundador del estudio NADA, con sede en los Estados Unidos, y es profesor y decano de la Escuela Cooper Union en Nueva York. Y Gabriel Feld es arquitecto también, originariamente de aquí de la Argentina, de la Universidad de Buenos Aires, radicado también en Estados Unidos hace muchos años, y es actualmente profesor en la Rhode Island School of Design en Providence, en Estados Unidos. El tema y ya termino con la introducción, es el problema de la enseñanza de la arquitectura, el diseño y el urbanismo. Esto es solo un lema general. Gabriel y Nader han dialogado entre ellos en estas últimas semanas para enfocar lo que nos van a presentar esta tarde, esta noche. Ellos van a hablar entre sí, entre una media hora o 40 minutos probablemente, y luego vamos a dar entrada a dos integrantes jóvenes docentes de nuestra universidad, que son Ailén Galgani y Rosendo Galiano, y con mi participación también. En una segunda media hora vamos a conversar sobre algunos de los temas que han aparecido en el diálogo entre Nader y Gabriel. Y en una tercera parte, quienes nos están viendo por el canal YouTube de la cátedra pueden por el chat hacer preguntas. Integrantes del equipo que nos da apoyo en este momento, a quienes agradezco, están detrás de las cámaras, pero están haciendo un trabajo muy valorable. Van a tomar algunas de esas preguntas y yo las voy a transmitir a la mesa. Bueno, y en ese momento estaremos en 1 hora y media aproximadamente, y nos vamos a ir despidiendo hasta la próxima ocasión. Así que, bueno, estamos muy felices de poder inaugurar este ciclo de conversaciones. Estamos seguros de que va a salir muy bien, y te dejo a vos, Gaby, la conducción de lo que sigue. Muchas gracias.
Muy bien. Buenas noches, buenas tardes. La verdad que es un gusto estar acá en Buenos Aires. Es raro pensar que allá es verano, o allá es primavera, acá es el otoño ya fresco. Antes de arrancar quisiera decir un par de cosas. Primero, agradecerle a Polo por la invitación, por la oportunidad de traer a Nader a la facultad, pero también por llevar adelante la cátedra Antonio Díaz, que la verdad que me parece que es una cosa muy importante, y que él es el centro del esfuerzo, y que todos tenemos que estar muy agradecidos por eso. La segunda cosa es un poco personal, que es que el otro día estaba pensando, yo empecé a trabajar con Tony cuando tenía 19 años, hace muchos años, y para mí Tony fue la figura central de mi educación como arquitecto y de mi educación como profesor. Por 10 años trabajamos juntos en la oficina, en el estudio, en la escuelita, en la facultad, con lo cual yo diría que toda mi formación en el fondo fue alrededor de Tony, alrededor del trabajo que hicimos con Tony y con Luis Ibarlucía. Lo que yo siempre digo, lo que yo no aprendí de Tony, lo aprendí de Luis. Y, bueno. Pero realmente para mí es un gusto tener la posibilidad de hablar con Nader acá sobre arquitectura y la enseñanza de la arquitectura en el contexto de la Cátedra Antonio Díaz. Y ahora para entrar, yo debo decir que yo conozco muchos muy buenos arquitectos que hacen buena arquitectura y que también enseñan. Y también conozco muy buenos profesores, educadores, que a veces hacen proyectos. Pero creo que Nader es una de las pocas personas que conozco, no sé si no es la única, que están al 100% como arquitectos que hacen edificios, que diseñan y construyen edificios, y al 100% como educador, como profesor. En el fondo es una cosa no muy común, trataría de pensar quién otro, pero definitivamente Nader, nos conocemos hace 30 años y es de las pocas personas con las cuales yo hablo de arquitectura, o por lo menos que me interesa hablar de arquitectura y de la enseñanza de la arquitectura. Cuando empezamos a pensar en esto, yo le pregunté un poco a Nader, ¿de qué hablamos cuando hablamos de la enseñanza de arquitectura? ¿Qué es lo que tenemos que hablar? Y algunas palabras que empezaron a aparecer eran cosas como incertidumbre, que no existen las respuestas concretas, las respuestas correctas, improvisación, colaboración, de nuevo la idea de la, para decirlo en inglés, uncertainty, not right answers, improvisation, collaboration. ¿Podrías expandir un poco más sobre esto?
Absolutely. But before I begin to put you on the spot, just to thank you for the kind introduction. I always like to say that as an architect, I'm a student of Rodolfo Machado and Jorge Silvetti, but as a teacher, I'm the student of Gabriel Feld. You don't have to take the blame for what happens tonight, but if it goes well, you can take the credits. Talking about teaching, or the phenomena of teaching, comes with certain mythologies. And the prime mythology has to do with the student as an empty vessel, going to school with a teacher filling that vessel full of knowledge, of information. And that model of certainty gives you the confidence of acting. But the reality behind that is that, particularly in schools of architecture, but probably in many other programs, we find ourselves in a world filled with uncertainty and change and transformation, that we realize that the facts and figures, the knowledge that we're given, do not suffice for the conditions of learning that may be required. And so, because of this, I have developed two modalities of thinking about this. And one has to do with a top-down thinking about teaching, but also a bottom-up mode of learning. And from the top down, I think of the centrality of history as the conduit through which we can debate about culture. But from bottom up, I think of the prospect of play as the basis for producing new forms of knowledge, or possibility creating things for which there are no precedents. Is that a good beginning?
Sí, excelente. Además, esto, tomando el tema del juego, o tomando el problema del juego, en un momento, en una de nuestras conversaciones, vos hablabas de que una de las cosas que uno enseña o que uno aprende son ver un cierto fenómeno y poder desmenuzarlo, dissected, más detalladamente. Y hablábamos de cinco significados distintos, 5 maneras de hacer un diagrama. ¿Podés hablar de eso un poquito? Tenés que poner el sonido.
Yeah. So, you know, we like to think in architecture that a commission or a project has certain problems, and you are there to solve the problem. But the reality is that first, before solving any problem, you have to define what is the problem in the first place. So I think one idea is to enter into the question of architecture by posing what is the question. But many times we also have to imagine that architecture can be pursued both through deductive reasoning as well as inductive reasoning. And so by virtue of that, sometimes you have an intuition about an outcome, and the entire design process is a process of demonstrating the line of reasoning of that intuition. And maybe the more interesting design process is when you don't know what you're doing at all, but you have just enough confidence to do 5, 6 different diagrams with no certain endings, with the possibility that they open up avenues for architectural consequences of significance. And I think that the way that the deductive and the inductive work together are an important part of playing with received knowledge from history, but also the, let's say, the intuitive play that produces diagrams of different configurations.
Es interesante que tendríamos que hablar del conocimiento y ahora estamos hablando de la ignorancia, de lo que no se sabe. ¿Te daría para dar un ejemplo? ¿Te da? ¿Haces un...?
We could diagram, for instance, the design of a library. In Boston, we were given the commission to do the Adams Library in South Boston, in Dorchester. Let me draw for you, if you don't mind. A site that essentially is composed of something like this, a site like that, and the imposition of various diagrams on that. And it was a participatory process, so we didn't know exactly. Every time we drew a scheme, we were killed because they did not want us to come up with our diagram. So we may come up with a diagram with a centralized scheme off of which there are different reading rooms for the adults, for the adolescents, and for the children. We may have other diagrams where those same groups are coming together around a common space together like that. But the reality is that during this process of discovery, we realized that they didn't want us to design anything. And so all we knew is that they wanted a single story building that would fill the site, excluding one zone where there's a huge oak tree around which they wanted maybe possibly to save that tree in that corner. And so part of the exercise of diagramming became how to get comfortable with the formless situation of architecture. And so we had to discover the rules. So one rule had to do with the panoptic inevitability of a control in the center, where a desk of the checkout is that is able to oversee the adults, the adolescents, and the children, and a direct relationship with the main street, which is in the front like that. The second acknowledgement had to do with where the front is, where the back is, and how to fill in the pieces around that. And somehow the diagram emerged that there might be one reading area for one group of people here, one reading area for another group of people here, another for one group of people here, and with the idea that, messy as it may seem, that there are services that go in the back somehow like this, that support all of the back rooms and essentially orchestrate the project. And so we were perplexed because with all of the clarity of the diagrams that we had, we didn't know how to give order to this. And somehow our sort of top-down thinking and bottom-up thinking had to give form to this. And so effectively what happened was we had to give a logic and a form to this. And essentially the bringing together of this form involved articulation of these programs like this, like this, like this, like this. Imagine a building with two legs like this that brings the southern light into these rooms like that, with a garden over here to bring more light into the center of the space. And then all of the kind of services, it doesn't matter what they are, can go to the back like this, with the idea of two legibilities that could be imposed onto this formless mass. And that had to do with a front, possibly, that is a single and civic and monumental gesture as a single roof, but also with a back that is part of the neighborhood, could take each of these programs that were in the back at different dimensions and give an elevation that essentially is a mirror of how they work in the back. And the presence of the roof became another intuition around which we revolved. Now, I haven't given you 5 diagrams. What I've given you is a complex process around which top-down thinking could not be tolerated because it's a public project.
¿Podés mostrar un poquito algo del proyecto?
Let me try to see if I can explain the same project through I'm sorry, I can't for some reason. Oh, maybe it's already open on the screen. Sorry, I apologize about that. Can you see my screen or not? Not yet. Okay. Can you see the screen? Yes?
Yes, sí.
So what I'm going to do is to describe, I'm going to play an animation which is synthetic and describes the entire idea behind this project, realizing that all of these were discoveries that we made at different points of interaction, studying the site ourselves, but also working with the client, negotiating it. Here, you're looking at the plan of the site in the way that they had asked us to conceive of a single-story building with the idea of a large monumental scale and the front street, but a promenade in the neighborhood, a shortcut for the neighborhood in the back that corresponded to some of the lower programs, a roofscape that is a fifth facade, a fifth elevation on which all of the neighbors look, the excavation of a south that would bring light into the dark core of the building, the insertion of two gardens, one existing and one new, and then the separation of the adults, the adolescents, and the kids on the north-south grain, but a structural system on the east-west grain that would describe what I call the sixth elevation, an exposed ceiling that becomes the incrustation of structure, lighting, sprinkler systems, mechanical systems, as the sandwich of space through which you frame the garden. This, I'm going to stop sharing, Gabriel.
Bueno, ahora ya has demostrado, digamos, ahora hemos hablado de arquitectura, o has hablado de arquitectura. Ahora la pregunta que te hago es, ¿cómo se enseña y cómo se aprende esto? No esto en particular, sino las cosas que uno necesita saber, aprender, enseñar para hablar de estas cosas, para hacer estas cosas.
I think there's two ways of going about this. One is top down and one is bottom up. And so, for instance, when you think of top down thinking, you think of all of the ways in which a building may be organized. And so you can say, okay, we are going to build a linear bar building that is single loaded. We can do a building that is organized with a central spine and it has the ability to be organized like this. We can do a building that has a courtyard with a kind of connection to that courtyard. All of these are known typologies with presumption, with the expectation that these will need to be transformed under any circumstances. And I suspect that your education in Buenos Aires and mine were common in that sense, that in some sense, education is a repository of hundreds or thousands of examples that kind of permeate one's mind, and part of it is not to emulate them, but rather to transform them. And so the second part of it has to do with a knowledge or an impregnation of malleability and distortability of that ideal, of that type. And that's where I would say the bottom-up thinking works. So the other like way I think is at a completely other scale, and we ask students to play with a unit of geometry or with a brick or with a wall. And I'm going to draw one or two things for you. If I draw, these are building types, right? But this here is just a triangle, right? But with that triangle, if I say make a hexagon out of that triangle, you say, okay, I can make a hexagon by cutting this, by cutting this, and by cutting this. And by doing that, I will get something that looks like this. If you think of that in an animate way, the bottom of that is a triangle. And as you go up and you keep truncating it, eventually you will get to a perfect hexagon like that as you transform it. But part of that is a discovery that the geometry has latent qualities, if you like, that make it predisposed to become. And so the prospect of becoming is a central part of this. The example I'd like to give you now, which is, it's sort of the prospect of thinking of a building from the bottom up, is our discovery of what a building can become as a result of thinking of the brick. And if you ask a student, here's a brick, I'm going to give you one brick. Now I want you to tell me, what can you do with this brick? And we know that the brick, essentially as a unit, is just that. And once you put other bricks next to it, you get some kind of stacking, and as you stack them, you end up getting the wall. The problem is that if you rely on top-down thinking, you end up with that wall, which does not permit you to design. But if you ask a different question about that wall, you may discover other things. So we asked the brick not anything about itself, but about the gap between it. And so we said, what happens if the dimension in between the brick is not the same?
Tenés que dibujar al costado. You have to draw to the side. Now it's too high.
Yeah. And so if you think of the bonding of a brick wall as a variable dimension, then you know that that bonding that we draw like this could become slightly wider or slightly wider or slightly wider and finally as wide as you can get before it is no longer structurally stable. And if you think of this in parametric terms, it is really what Leverance does when he's essentially floating his bricks in a sea of mortar without the same calculations of this. But the idea that a building may emerge from the recognition that bricks can move like that is also the same discovery as imagining that a brick might be hinged from that point and be able to rotate out in another configuration like that. And so this variability to which I speak has been a central part of the games that we have played for now 2-3 decades. So if you like, I can show you different ways in which these two modes have come into play. I can show you one or two examples of these. One of them has to do with the brick, let's say. Let me see if I can slide this down. This is the image of Leverance and his principle of the no bricks that are cut. But this is a classic example here of one of our projects that essentially is the result of an expandable bonding system that takes advantage of the system that I just drew on the board. And by not cutting bricks and folding them along those creases and corbelling them in one side and another, it produces a low resolution wall of sorts that is able to be structurally stable. The question that we had to ask ourselves was how to form this. And by identifying the center of a brick, the dimensions of which that could be expanded to become a bonding system, we were able then to somehow imagine how that can become the architecture. So in a strange sense, this is a moment where a system precedes the building and can be adapted to many different building organizations. I'll do one other one, but from the other perspective down. I'll do the courtyard building, which is essentially this project here, where we had to ask ourselves, what can this courtyard building do to adapt itself to an anomalous site? And this is the way
Ahora no vemos nada. We don't see anything right now.
Oh, wait, can you see this?
No.
All right, let me stop.
And share. There you go. Share again.
Okay. Can you see something on your screen?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, so this is a moment. I showed you the brick starting with a kernel of matter and then imagining what a building can become of it. This is a moment where we work with a given typology, a courtyard that distorts and looks for its form as a result of the site deformation and the views that are able to be had from it. The recognition that it's not a flat landscape, that the slope may terrace the building in bias of the view, making connections at the corner where the staircases would have to connect the public areas of the house with the private. And then the invention of the idea that the landscape is allowed subsequently to come up and through the building in order to connect back to the top. And this building is immaterial, not that it's not made of materials, but that it is agnostic initially. It is thought of in typological terms, whereas some of these studies have to do with the bottom up. And so I guess a lot of the questions that we bring to the students have to do with the multiple agencies, contradictory agencies that you're confronted with. Imagine that there are urbanistic triggers that require one thing. Imagine material cultures that give other opportunities. Imagine programmatic impingements that give difficulty of putting everything together, and then imagine typological triggers from history that may motivate all of this coming together. None of this will come together organically. There's something that needs to take bias, and usually they're a competition between bottom-up thinking and top-down. And so these were maybe two examples of that.
Sí, Nader, recién cuando te escuchaba, pensaba, si yo fuera un estudiante ahora estaría asustado. I would be frightened. Por dos razones. Una, porque todo esto parece muy difícil, pero en el fondo porque me imagino, digamos, si yo me pongo como estudiante a hacer estas cosas, me van a dar unos proyectos feísimos. Y a mí una de las cosas que yo a veces digo es que algunos de tus proyectos son realmente feos. Y eso es un elogio que te estoy haciendo. Tenés que sonreír, si no, bueno. Y no, te quería preguntar cómo hace un estudiante para hacer un proyecto feo. Y después te quería pedir si no podías explicar un poco el proyecto de Melbourne, que me parece uno de esos proyectos feos, o imposibles de explicar si no ves cómo se originan.
But before we get there, the question of aesthetics and beauty is one of those things that we take for granted, because we think of beauty as a Hippocratic oath, that like doctors, we should do no harm. But of course, cultural differences, intersubjectivities, received traditions, and projected polemics produce very different situations for everyone. And because of that, I would say that we must somehow figure out how to ask questions without the fear of ugliness in order to define what the question is in the first place. You asked about Melbourne, and I'm going to tell you the difficulty of the site. It was essentially a site plan, again, a big, deep, fat square with no front or no back. There was a street here that could be a courtyard. There was an alleyway here. There was a plaza here on one side, and there was another street here. And the building had to front on all four sides without any recourse to a back. And so the dimensions were so deep on both sides that the only way to bring light into this is either to have a big courtyard like that, or to find other ways in which you can bring light into this in smaller ways. But that's just the beginning. In section, the challenge really was how to construct on this very flat site a new ground on which you could go from one side of the site all the way through to the other side because of an important connection that was required through the site. And so somehow to imagine that there would be a new piano nobile, which is the beginning of the building, one floor above, so that all of the public elements of the building could be on the ground floor. And so imagine that you have all of the school-wide events for auditoriums and classrooms that are for dark spaces can all go underground like this. Libraries, galleries, all of the public events go down here, and then the school starts from that point in Melbourne. Now the problem is that conceptually, the building was thought through as a studio building, meaning that they wanted somehow a studio that would be at the top of the building that has views of Melbourne where everybody is designing together.
Baja el dibujo, baja el dibujo.
Oh, sorry. A building with a studio like that on top that has a view onto the city, and then have all of the offices and classrooms essentially underneath that, with the idea that you could introduce holes into this and bring light into this. And the most key thing is that this then could be a new ground with the caveat that you don't want structure there, because you need this to be flexible for exhibitions, for lectures, for social space, and for casual working. So really what happened was two important things. One, we lost the budget for the studio. And two, the idea that this space over here had to become the studio itself. And so the diagram of the building emerged as an inversion of how you build a building. If normally you build a building up like that, the question was, how do we build that building basically going like this without touching the ground, allowing the ground to float rather than to sit on the ground like this. And so what effectively happened was that we connected structurally down to the ground here, like that, and then down to the ground here like that. And then that space over here became essentially a structural coffer. And from that, we widened essentially the circulation space to become the studio space on either side. And then most importantly, the one space that we had to create a dedicated studio is that we took the structural system that was spanning 22 meters and we suspended the studio space somehow upside down over here. So effectively, the flexibility of the ground is maintained left and right, but then dedicated studios would go from the flexible spaces to that space. So all of these spaces would become studio spaces that are hot desks, with the idea that they have access to these spaces in the middle. This inversion produces an effect. By the way, I mean, these are not innocent either. You have Banco de Londres, you have your own library, which are some of the most beautifully grotesque buildings that I've seen. But I think they also come with a structural inversion that is central to their conception. And I would be lying to you if I told you that this is an invention, but it came from a kind of dialectic of a wrestling between an understanding of history and this new circumstances with which we were faced. But the question was, how do you hang a building upside down rather than building it up from the ground?
¿Podés mostrar un par de imágenes?
Yes, let me. So I'm going to show you a couple of diagrams. One has to do with the urban conception of this thing, because the urbanism is really an extension of the campus at large. And the idea that these neo-Georgian courts are all around and that the building somehow needs to be an extension of that logic. And given the depth and the width of the building, the idea that the foundation of the building would be the skylight and that everything would descend from that skylight, illuminating the center, but also activating it by programming all of its edges. But at the core of it, having lost the studio above, the idea of this space around which everything revolves. So this is the studio space that is then transformed into these spaces that borrows the spaces from the side and essentially activates them through these furnishings that allow you to eliminate railings, and that the furnishings become the railings of this space. So conceptually then, really this had to do with this moment. These are the moments that I like most. I don't know if this is worthy of recognition or not, but from an academic point of view, the idea of conjoining different histories in the way that architects like to do between diachronic and synchronic histories, the idea that the Tempietto or Kahn's museum or Gehry's building in Berlin have a common fascination with this central totemic object, monumentalized by virtue of its framing, its incarceration within a court. In the Tempietto, what is incredible about it is that you see a monumental building, though miniature in dimension, it is amplified by its context. If the context is very impure, the building is like a mock-up of something that has yet to become St. Peter's. Gehry's is one of his more interesting buildings because the figurative and the generic are in stark contrast with each other, and that contrast produces the necessary figurative difference between the center and the fabric in the background. Kahn's is more delicate and has more connection to what we're doing, because you notice that the concrete of the edges have an organic relationship with the drum itself. Even though you don't know what the function of the drum is, you recognize somehow that it's structurally linked to the frame. Now imagine if you translate that into non-typological terms, but topological terms, taking the depth of the structure to span the entire space about 3 meters deep, angling the cross bracing so you get indirect light, and then from that you suspend large members of wood hanging in tension until they're veneers of wood when they get to the bottom. A kind of rustication in inverse. And this logic is really made up of wood that's massive at the top and thin at the bottom, something that you can even verify when you're there on site.
Nader, sí, si mostrás bueno, muy bien. Ya estamos más o menos llegando como al final de la conversación, pero me gustaría hacerte una última pregunta que tiene que ver con la responsabilidad social del arquitecto y cómo eso se enseña y cómo eso se piensa. Y después de eso, te lo pregunto como una pregunta más para empezar que para terminar, about social and environmental responsibility. Y después incorporamos a Polo y a sus profesores.
It's an important question about social responsibility, and if the knee-jerk reaction is to establish a meaningful relationship with your community, your society, and to solve problems for them, there are many and productive ways of doing that through your profession. But I want to underscore that the pedagogical moment does not need to emulate the conditions of contemporary practice in order to contribute back to society, because practice as it is formed today, is often molded around antiquated practices or compromised political situations. And so if the school is not a space for speculation, for transformation, for polemics, and for even theoretical explorations, it can never have cast a shadow back on practice in effect afterwards. So that is the one important thing that we have to heed. The other one has to do with this sometimes unnecessary positivistic attribute of education, that we have to solve problems here and now, but some problems have existed for 2,000 of years and will exist another 1,000 years. And so there's another model of education, I would argue, that is rooted in the productivity of an anachronism, that the conversation you're having is not just with society's challenges today, but a larger set of challenges that we've had over hundreds of years. And that your work, your research, your writing, and your buildings are having this longer conversation with a longue durée. And the third one has to do with this delicate area of social responsibility that is often misconstrued. Given the nature of expertise, architectural discourse sometimes is confused with a form of elitism. But I would hold here that part of our social responsibility is also to bring a higher level of discourse, but with it, the responsibility of translation and communication with the other audiences that we should be cultivating.
Fantástico, Nader. Me parece que acá podemos cerrar nuestra parte de la conversación. Hay dos cosas que acabas de decir que me hacen acordar muchísimo a Tony. Una es que siempre hablábamos de la arquitectura y del anacronismo, casi como una especie de virtud de la arquitectura de ser anacrónica. Y la otra cosa es que yo me acuerdo cuando Tony empezó la cátedra en el 84, más o menos, me acuerdo, una de las primeras cosas que Tony dijo es que la educación no puede ser una simulación de la práctica. Y creo que esto lo decís ahora, lo decía Tony hace, ¿cuánto? 84, ¿cuánto? Hace muchísimos años que lo parió. Bueno, me parece que acá es un buen punto para traerlos a Polo y a sus profesores, ¿no? Polo, ¿estás ahí? Chicos, no sé, ¿qué dicen?
Bueno, invitamos a Ailén y a Rosendo a mostrarse. Fantástico.
Ustedes arranquen de acá, ¿sí?
Sí, realmente dan muchas ganas de continuar escuchándolos. Pasó una hora y parece mentira. Yo me voy a limitar a subrayar 2 o 3 cuestiones que creo que son relevantes en el contexto de esto que estamos haciendo, y luego enseguida le paso la palabra a Ailén y a Rosendo, que aprovecho para presentar a ambos. Ellos han sido estudiantes de nuestra cátedra de proyectos en años recientes, y Rosendo, Ailén no tanto, pero se han incorporado con mucho entusiasmo al programa de enseñanza de nuestra cátedra, y nos interesa especialmente que este tipo de encuentros, estas conversaciones, vinculen profesores, profesoras de mucha relevancia y trayectoria, como son en este caso Nader y Gabriel, con quienes van a tener esa misma responsabilidad en el futuro, y retomar su contacto con, como bien decía Gabriel recién, con debates de larga data. Yo creo que es fundamental esto que señala Nader en respuesta a tu última pregunta, Gaby, respecto a esto de que un programa de enseñanza de arquitectura, de diseño o de urbanismo que tenga valor no puede ser una copia, una emulación o una preparación directa, mecánica, como también diría Tony seguramente, para una práctica profesional que hoy es de cierta manera, pero cada vez con mayor evidencia ya es y va a continuar siendo de otra manera. Y para eso es esto del anacronismo que pone de manifiesto Nader es muy importante, ¿no? Porque en el fondo casi todo es anacrónico, ¿no? En la presentación que hacíamos a la charla de Jorge Silvetti hace un par de años, destacábamos algo que creíamos que es parte de esto que forma parte de esta larga trayectoria de los programas educativos, pero también profesionales y teóricos de las últimas décadas, que es esto de producir una arquitectura lo menos falsa posible, ¿no? Sabiendo que por esta cuestión del anacronismo, precisamente esa cuestión, entre comillas, falsa, es positiva, pero que tenemos que hacerla a nuestra práctica, tanto pedagógica como profesional, como teórica, lo menos falsa que podamos. Una sola o dos cuestiones más que creo que son muy importantes de la conversación entre ambos, pero que emergen como preguntas adicionales, que las dejo para el momento en el que, si tenemos tiempo, poder abordarlas, que es, primero, si la cuestión de las escalas más urbanas, más amplias, a escala de una ciudad, de una metrópolis, de una región, de un territorio, si estos enfoques de arriba hacia abajo y de abajo hacia arriba, como modo de comprender, pero también como modo de operar en la educación, en qué medida se cambian de naturaleza, se modifican o cuestiones distintas que hay que considerar cuando se trata de concebir y operar en escalas mayores, digamos. Primera cuestión. Y segundo, dado que tanto Nader como Gabriel han sido responsables de escuelas enteras de arquitectura, cómo estas cuestiones se integran en un programa completo de enseñanza, de una escuela completa que típicamente tiene sus cursos de proyecto, estudios, sus cursos de historia, sus cursos de tecnologías, sus cursos de estudio de la forma y de la representación, es decir, en programas completos de una escuela, cómo esto se traduce en términos de especificidad, integralidad, cuestiones que aparecen cuando hay que manejar una escuela de arquitectura o de diseño o de urbanismo. Bueno, yo dejo estas líneas solamente para ver si podemos retomarlas, y quien quiera, Ailén o Rosendo, Ailén quizá, siendo la dama en esta conversación, si quiere comentar alguna cuestión.
Yo iba a volver un poco al inicio de la charla. A mí personalmente hay algo que me interesa, que es esto que habla Nader de la ecuación que hay, la tensión que hay entre lo figurativo y los procesos configurativos. Lo configurativo como idea de sistema que puede extrapolarse, y creo que lo profundizó un poco con estos ejemplos que dio. Y mi pregunta es, en el ámbito del taller de arquitectura, al plantearlos como conceptos, si uno va primero que el otro o si son conceptos que se dan en paralelo y se están tensionando constantemente.
I think this is a very good question because some of the material operations and explorations are happening over many, many years, many, many projects. And you're thinking in different systems of aggregation, and you think you're designing for this building, but actually you're designing for another building and another occasion. So the simple answer is an architectural practice is often a research that is much more seamless and continuous, but the architectural commission is one instantiation in many other conditions in which this will become embodied. And so the configurative work that we did with materials, the Casa La Roca that I showed today was never built, but was translated to the Tongxian Gatehouse in China and the Hukaden in Mantra in Boston. And then they changed our way of thinking for another system that was for wood instead of for brick. So it has this kind of consequence.
Nader, creo que la pregunta de Ailén de lo figurativo y lo configurativo te entendió perfectamente. ¿Podés responder la pregunta desde el punto de vista de un educador, de un profesor, desde la enseñanza? ¿Podés?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's important to think of the configurative. Okay, if you think of a system, you have to think of not only what the system can do, but what are the extremities of that system. How malleable is it? How much can you push it geometrically, structurally, and programmatically? And so the figurative composition of the curtain that undulates in Casa La Roca is a demonstration of how far you can take the configurative system. So in part, as an academic or as a researcher, the question that we would pose is, what are the components of a system, and what are their parameters, and what are their constraints, and what are their rule sets? But as a figurist, you're also asking, what are the formal consequences of having pushed the system to its ultimate limit? And how does that confront the site, the program, and other mandates that architecture needs to comply with? I want to remind you that as architects, we're not lost in a system of abstractions. We're also integrating very complex circumstances with critical decisions to make. So in a way, we're much more like orchestrators. So that tension between the figurative and the configurative has to also come with something that not all our architects have, and that is an ethical social contract between part to whole. I remind you, there are many a building and many an architect who are able to cut the umbilical cord between these two, so that the constructive capacities of units have absolutely nothing to do with the spatial and formal consequences. So one of the consequences of your question has to do with the fidelity of the figurative and the configurative in a kind of social contract. Gabriel, does that answer?
Sí. Bueno, a ver, ahora yo ya te diría, yo me tiro para atrás y Rosendo, Ailén o Polo síganlo ustedes.
Muy bien, bueno, muchas gracias. por compartir esto con nosotras. Yo tengo dos cuestiones, no sé si va a alcanzar el tiempo para las dos, pero una tiene que ver con esto de lo anacrónico, pero retomando algún concepto de Tony, que son las resonancias temporales, que nosotros trabajamos mucho en el taller, tanto en proyecto urbano como en proyecto arquitectónico, las resonancias temporales y las alegorías, y qué relación tiene eso con la experiencia de los estudiantes, las experiencias que hayan vivido antes de incluso cursar lo que les toque cursar con nosotros. Entonces, en ese sentido, si uno puede contribuir y de qué manera, o si ustedes tienen como confianza en esa práctica, de contribuir a las experiencias de los estudiantes y de las estudiantes, ¿no? Y después lo otro tiene por ahí más que ver con algo más organizativo, quizá tiene que ver con lo que dijo Polo, respecto de cómo se articula en un programa de una escuela de arquitectura, cómo se articula, sobre todo en escenarios en donde, por ejemplo, los recursos son más limitados, o por lo menos, quizá operativamente, lo pienso como si ustedes en su experiencia, también retomando la idea de la experiencia, consideran que hay algún tipo de medida para el tamaño de la clase, por ejemplo, para la relación de estudiantes y docentes, para que se dé ese escenario en donde se puedan dictar clases. Porque nosotros hemos experimentado a lo largo de la historia de la FADU y de la UBA distintos escenarios en donde hay clases más masivas y donde hay espacios como los que estamos más acostumbrados en todos los diseños, que son más de taller. Así que esas dos cuestiones, no sé si alcanza el tiempo para todo.
So I need to ask a question about the first question. The first question. What is in Díaz's parlance? What does temporal resonance mean? What did he mean by that?
Acá Gaby, a ver si nos podés dar una mano para en inglés dar cuenta.
No, vos ahora encargate.
Se trata, Nader, voy a tratar de ser claro en español y en todo caso intento hacerlo en inglés. Se trata de en qué medida a través de lo figurativo la arquitectura puede evocar en el público en general, socialmente hablando, situaciones felices, gratas, que tienen que ver con su historia, con su situación social, con sus aspiraciones. De eso se trata la resonancia temporal conducida a través de la arquitectura.
Is it fair to compare temporal resonance to the collective imaginary?
Yes.
The
Yes.
idea
Yes.
that architecture has this capacity to engage the public realm, sometimes in a more imprecise way, but that captures the imagination across generations, across time, and with the malleability to engage the public realm, I would say. And I'm connecting this question to Polo's first question about urbanism, and what I consider something that Gabriel, you and I never really spoke about, is that for architecture to be able to somehow enter into dialogue or into significance or into relevance, it is its contract with the city or the contract with the environment. And that, if there isn't that contract, in a way you have no possibility to enter into this question about temporal resonance, which I think has to do as much with responding to culture as it is to building audiences. And I say this with care because I think that sometimes we are trained to respond to culture, but we forget that architecture is here to build culture or to build audiences. One as an extension of this discussion, Gabriel and I had a discussion that is very worrisome for me, that I wonder how this impacts your thinking in Buenos Aires. And it has to do with the 40 years of public erosion that I have witnessed in the country in which I'm living now, and with the incremental privatization of those things that are public space, infrastructure, and I could go on to health, education, and many other things. But the idea that these are no longer part of a public commitment also means the abdication of a government or a governance to that lowest common denominator that binds us all together. And I think architecture is one of those things that we have to come to terms with, Polo, like never before, because now it is inconsequential to draw a representation of the city without understanding its relationship to the territory or to the globe at large, because the ways in which data and information gathering has been made possible, we understand that the borders are never national. They are ecological, they are geological, and so the strict relationships between the city and the rural areas are no longer describable in the social terms that we were used to characterizing them with. And so this opens up another discussion about urbanism that has to do with a discipline that doesn't yet have the tools with which to draw out its consequences in the way that we did when we were in school. I feel that there's a very radical schism between what is happening in urbanism and what can happen in urbanism now.
Eso nos lleva en uno de tus últimos textos que tuvimos a mano. Vos decís que haces mucho hincapié en una nueva agencia para el arquitecto, para la arquitectura en general. Y esta necesidad de, lo decís de esta manera, que la arquitectura o el arquitecto o arquitecta use distintos sombreros. En un momento es diseñador, en otro momento es activista, en otro momento es distintas cuestiones. Sería interesante si podés profundizar o ampliar sobre esta noción de agencia, distintos sombreros, situaciones a las cuales probablemente nos estemos dirigiendo, cómo tiene que tomar un programa educativo estas cuestiones.
I think that as educators, we have at least two responsibilities. Our responsibility to other architects and students is one thing, and we are performing that theater right here, right now. But the reality is that if architects cannot translate their expertise to municipalities, states, and forms of governance, we have failed in translating a language, a discourse that has many areas of depth to demonstrate the consequences of the evolution of planning and urban design at the larger scale. And part of this is something that you're beginning to see at the international level with the breakdown of the Paris Accord, which is no light theme, because governance is no longer limited to national boundaries. But part of this has to do also with the recognition by architects that if you look at the planet Earth, there probably is not 1% of it that either is not designed or is not impacted by human activity. And so our agency, if it is to become in any way consequential, for better or for worse, has to find ways to translate complex matter to a much broader audience in order for them to recognize not only the scientific consequences, but also the everyday consequences of their appreciation of the very environment in which they're living. So questions of pleasure, beauty, and a different form of living come into that equation. But agency has to do with the translation of our disciplinary terms into political instruments. I say this without any apology. If we're inconsequential from a political perspective, then what is it that we're doing here?
En relación con esto, yo iría introduciendo dos preguntas de la audiencia que nos está viendo por el canal. Hago la primera porque tiene relación con esto último que estás comentando, Nader. Ampliar cuál es la importancia que das en estos términos políticos, sociales, a los procesos participativos en los proyectos de los cuales has hablado en el primero de los ejemplos de arquitectura que has mostrado.
It's such a delicate question because like many other architects, I recognize this fundamental predicament between a social commitment to engaging society, working with society, and responding to it, but being genetically composed as an architect, I am taught to specify and to control things. And the instinct to specify and control produces the mentality of Gesamtkunstwerk. You know, the idea that if left alone, not only will I design the building, but also the clothing of all of its inhabitants. And this is one of the most unfortunate and important lessons that sometimes it takes too long to learn. The idea that sometimes the best control has to do with a loosening of the reins. By drawing in that participation, knowing fully well that they don't usually have the tools with which to manipulate formal, spatial, and material data, but they have a palpable resonance with respect to their social realities and their comforts and their identification as human beings. And part of our responsibility is to be able to bridge this gap. And I think that some people have this amazing capacity to do that. I am guilty of having operated in that other reality for at least 20 years before I opened up to this possibility that to gain control, you have to abdicate all marriage to a single project. You have to think of all projects as an infinitely malleable set of circumstances that are able to absorb incredible frictions. And so I find it a very fascinating question, because also I fundamentally disagree and I'm fearful of designing by committee. Because the idea of designing by committee sometimes gives you nothing. It's in English what is called milquetoast, which is bland, without any constitution, without any ideas, and without any commitments. So I actually think the great architect is probably the one who's able to genuinely absorb cultural differences and its audiences, but also reassemble it so that it's something larger than the sum of its parts. And that conceptual commitment is part of that agency that I'm talking about as much as anything else. You, Polo, asked another question that is connected to this indirectly. And it has to do with the question of what is the synthetic pedagogical project. And if it is not evident from your perspective, the US has gone through many challenging times over the last year. And Black Lives Matter and the question of decolonization and the other cultural consequences of globalization have really challenged what we do as a core in architecture, with all of its underpinnings being essentially defined by what we call Western culture and its canons. And so once you challenge those very canons and begin to absorb a much wider repertoire of cultural circumstances into architecture, there is an interesting question as to how you reconstitute a sequence that by definition needs to be much more expansive, but also non-linear, because it now needs to be broken down into either case studies or a mode of research that is able to learn lessons from fragments, but adapt them through critical questions to other circumstances. I don't know if this is too abstract, but I think that this is also trying to link your two questions.
Agregaría, Gabriel nos ha contado de un proyecto educativo que ha propuesto para Irán, y ahí nos gustaría conocer, tiene un poco que ver con la pregunta de Rosendo también, de si estos problemas o estas cuestiones tienen particularidades según sea el país o la región en la cual estemos considerando un programa educativo o de práctica profesional. ¿Estas cuestiones son similares en un país como Irán o con el contexto sudamericano que creo que tú que conoces bastante bien, África? ¿Cómo deben pensarse estas cuestiones en términos de, por ejemplo, riqueza y pobreza, contextos de enseñanza acotada en términos de cantidades de estudiantes que hay en las escuelas pequeñas, medianas o muy grandes, como son las nuestras, por ejemplo? ¿Qué cuestiones aparecen?
Please correct me if I go astray into the wrong direction, but let me say that your question would pose a slightly different color a year ago before the pandemic and now. But I'm going to answer it both ways. The project that we did in Iran to basically bring the world to Iran in order to produce discourse there had to do with a cultural eclipse, in the sense that it was a country that for 30, 40 years was essentially alienated from the world, and yet the internet had introduced a plethora of discourse, but without context. And so it was interesting in the sense that it exposed the fact that in the process of learning, part of the most fecund parts of education are mistranslations and misunderstandings. So the prospect of approximation was as important as understanding concepts. And so all of my discussions in Iran were based on approximate translations. And part of them had to do with in different intellectual paradigms. Just because I said something, it didn't mean it would be relevant for them, because from their cultural perspective, they were translating it into different terms. The second point I want to make has to do with the pandemic moment, and not what the hardship that we're all going through. The scandalous thing about the pandemic is how easily the entire world adapted to the internet as a means of communication, education, and conversation. I tried to come to Buenos Aires a year ago and we failed. And now I can come 5 times if you want. So, but part of that also means that the internet that has served us, for over 20 years now, has essentially arrived at its instrumental moment in being able to transport, translate, and flatten the North and the South, the wealth and poverty to some degree, and offer an alternative to synchronous learning. And so this stand, and the theory, of course, is that the vaccine will arrive, the pandemic will leave, but traces of these technological moments that we're going through right now should not ever leave, because they offer benefits that in-person contact never gave. And so how to balance out these new modalities is part of the question that you're asking, I think.
Está muy bien. Muchas gracias. Vamos a ir cerrando, si les parece. Me gustaría preguntar si Gabriel, Ailén, Rosendo quieren agregar alguna última consideración, o Nader, inclusive alguna cuestión que podamos haber no tocado. Creo que ha sido una conversación riquísima, podemos estar muy satisfechos de eso, pero si quieren agregar algo, no sé, Gaby.
No, la verdad que yo encantado. Tomando lo que decía Nader, que ahora podemos hacer estas cosas que antes no podíamos hacer, pero ahora podemos hacer. En el fondo, antes también la podíamos hacer, solo que no lo habíamos pensado. Y bueno, nada más que decir que si de esto lo podemos seguir haciendo, que sea el principio de otros diálogos, no mucho más, y que ha sido un gusto.
And from my perspective, just a dear thanks for the invitation, Polo and Gabriel, for hosting the event. If it showed anything, is that there are many themes, and that this could have been divided into 5 discussions into 5 different sessions. But I really do look forward to coming back to Buenos Aires in person, and certainly to share some time in person with you. So thank you so much.
Muchísimas gracias. Sí, da para un aplauso virtual. Quedaron algunas preguntas, una o dos, sin tratar. Alguna de ellas tiene mucha relación con las cuestiones que ya se han comentado. Estamos en el límite de tiempo que comprometimos, sobre todo a Nader, para esta oportunidad. Yo, bueno, para cerrar, quisiera agradecer nuevamente y enormemente a todas las personas que han hecho posible esta primera ocasión de conversaciones, de diálogos sobre este tema, muy especialmente a Nader. Sabemos la persona ocupada que es con sus múltiples compromisos. Creo que ha salido muy bien y esperamos seguir con estas cuestiones, y ha sido una muy buena apertura, creo. Gracias a Ailén, Rosen, Gaby y a todo el equipo, y bueno, muchas gracias, Nader, nuevamente.
Buenas noches.
Seguimos.
Buenas noches, muchas gracias.
Hasta la próxima.
Muchas gracias.